The winter that year descended upon the Grand Duke's palace like a sentence passed down from some merciless tribunal, all howling winds and ice that crept along the ancient stone corridors like fingers searching for warmth to extinguish. In the deepest reaches of the servants' quarters, where the cold settled heaviest and the lamplight struggled against perpetual shadow, there existed a small chamber that most of the palace staff avoided the boot room, they called it, though its official purpose had long been forgotten beneath layers of neglect and the particular duty it now served. It was here that Ilara found herself on the first day of her 16th winter, a young servant girl with hands already roughened by work and eyes that held both wariness and a stubborn sort of hope that poverty had not yet managed to extinguish. The head housekeeper, a woman whose face seemed carved from the same grey stone as the palace walls, had delivered her instructions in clipped tones. "You will tend to His Grace's boots. He leaves them at dawn. They must be cleaned and polished by nightfall. You will speak to no one of what you see upon them. You will ask no questions. You will perform this duty until such time as you are dismissed from it or from service entirely." The woman's eyes had held a strange mixture of pity and warning, as though Ilara had been assigned not merely a task, but a kind of trial whose nature she could not yet comprehend. The whispers had reached her. Of course, servants' gossip travelled through the palace like smoke through cracks, impossible to contain. The Duke, they said, had returned from the war 3 years prior wearing a mask of silver that he never removed, his face so hideously disfigured that even battle-hardened soldiers had turned away in horror. He walked the palace halls like a ghost, they said, speaking only when necessity demanded, refusing all company, spurning every attempt at social grace or courtly engagement. Some claimed his scars were punishment for wartime atrocities. Others whispered of cursed enemy fire that had marked him as surely as any brand. Ilara had seen him only once, from a distance, a tall figure in black moving through the eastern corridor, the silver mask catching lamplight like a second moon, cold and distant and utterly alone. When the boots arrived that first morning, left outside the boot room door as promised, she had stood before them for a long moment before touching them, her heart beating with an fear she could not name. They were enormous things, black leather, scarred and scuffed, caked with mud that had frozen during the night journey from wherever the Duke had ridden. But it was not the mud that made her hands tremble as she lifted them. It was the dark stains she recognized too well, the rust-brown evidence of blood that had soaked into the leather and dried there, telling stories she was not certain she wished to read. The boots were heavy in her arms, heavy with more than mere weight, and as she carried them to the workbench and laid them beneath the lamplight, she understood with a clarity that frightened her that she had been given not merely boots to clean, but fragments of a life to witness, pieces of a soul she had been entrusted to handle with care. Though no one had explained why this particular duty had fallen to her, of all the servants in that vast and whispering palace, the ritual established itself with the quiet inevitability of winter snow accumulating on windowsills, each day adding another layer to what would become, though Ilara did not yet know it, the foundation of something far more significant than mere duty. She rose before dawn, when the palace still slumbered beneath its blankets of darkness and cold, and made her way through corridors lit by guttering candles to the boot room, where the Duke's boots would be waiting like dark sentinels outside her door, returned from whatever nocturnal journey had claimed him the night before. She learned to read them as others might read correspondence or ledgers, noting the patterns that emerged with each passing week. Some mornings the mud was black and deep, speaking of rides through the forest where the earth never quite dried, even in winter's grip, and she imagined him riding hard beneath bare branches, seeking something in that darkness that the palace could not provide. Other days brought red clay from the southern hills, suggesting visits to the military garrison where he had once commanded, and on these mornings the boots carried themselves differently, she thought, with a weight that was not merely physical, but something closer to memory made tangible. The blood became less frequent as the weeks passed, transitioning from the rust-brown stains of her first encounter to occasional spots that might have been his own from a fall or a horse's injury, and she took this as a good sign, evidence of healing, or at least of a man less determined to court danger in the night hours. She developed her own ritual for the cleaning, working the mud loose with soft brushes, before applying the saddle soap in circular motions that became almost meditative, then the careful application of oil to keep the leather supple, and finally the polish that brought forth a shine she knew he would never notice, but that satisfied something in her own soul, a desire to give her best to this task, even if it went unacknowledged. The Duke himself appeared each evening near dusk to retrieve them, never varying his time by more than a quarter hour, his tall frame filling the doorway in a way that made the small room seem smaller still, the silver mask catching the lamplight and throwing it back in cold fragments that never quite reached his eyes. Their exchanges in those first months were brief, to the point of terseness. He would nod, she would curtsy, he would take the boots from the stand where she left them, and he would depart, the entire encounter consuming perhaps 30 seconds of time that nonetheless left her heart beating faster for reasons she could not have articulated even to herself. But she noticed things, small details that accumulated like the snow outside. His hands, ungloved when he reached for the boots, were long-fingered and bore scars of their own, the hands of a man who had held both pen and sword and knew the weight of each. The way he paused sometimes at the threshold, just for a moment, as though he wished to speak but could not find the words or the justification for speaking them to a servant girl whose name he had never asked. And once, near the end of that first winter when the light had begun to linger a few minutes longer each evening, he had given her the smallest nod, not the perfunctory acknowledgement of her curtsy, but something else, something that held the ghost of recognition, of seeing her not merely as the girl who cleaned his boots but as a person who performed this service, and she had carried that nod with her like a candle flame cupped in her palms, warming herself with it through the remaining cold weeks until spring finally arrived, and the ice began, at last, to break. Spring arrived with the reluctant grace of something long imprisoned, finally allowed its freedom, the ice retreating from the palace grounds in slow defeat, revealing earth that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of warmth and now had to learn it again, incrementally, day by precious day. The boot room's traffic changed, with the season less mud, more dust from the dry roads, the leather bearing traces of pollen and the crushed petals of early flowers, where the Duke's horse had carried him, through awakening meadows rather than frozen forests, and Ilara found herself grateful for this evidence of softer journeys, of a man perhaps seeking beauty rather than merely escape. The arrangement continued as it had through winter, the daily exchange of soiled boots for cleaned ones, the brief evening encounters that consisted of more silence than speech, yet the silence itself had become a kind of language between them, comfortable in its own wordless way. But spring brought other things as well, carried on the same winds that dispersed the last of winter's grip, gossip that flowered in the servants' quarters as reliably as crocuses in the garden, whispered conversations that Ilara could not help but overhear as she took her meals in the kitchen or passed through corridors on her way to and from her chamber. The Duke's isolation had become legendary, they said, his refusal to attend court functions now a source of embarrassment to the king himself. And there were darker stories too, tales of the Princess Katerina, who had been brought from a neighboring kingdom 3 summers past, betrothed to the Duke before the war had taken his face along with so much else. She had been beautiful, they said, a creature of sunlight and laughter, and she had tried, oh how she had tried, to see past the silver mask to the man beneath, but when he had finally revealed himself to her in the privacy of the formal gardens, she had screamed. They said, screamed, and fled back to her father's kingdom that very night, breaking the engagement and leaving behind only a letter of apology so formal it might as well have been written by diplomats rather than a woman who had just shattered whatever remained of a wounded man's hope. Monster, she called him. The kitchen maid whispered to the scullery boy, while Ilara pretended not to listen, her hands occupied with her own simple meal. Said his face was God's judgment on him for whatever sins he committed in the war, that she couldn't bear to look upon it, let alone, and here the maid's voice dropped to a hiss that Ilara had to strain to hear, let alone share his bed and bear his children. The scullery boy had laughed, a cruel sound that made Ilara's fingers tighten around her spoon. Can't blame her, can you? They say half his face is melted like candle wax, that you can see bone through the scars. It was then that Ilara found herself speaking, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. You speak of things you know nothing about, she said quietly, and the kitchen fell silent, all eyes turning to her, the strange girl from the boot room who rarely joined their conversations. His Grace is a man, not a monster, and whatever his face may bear, it bears the marks of service to this kingdom, not judgment upon it. The head cook had laughed, a sound like gravel shifting. Listen to our little boot polisher, defending the Duke. And what would you know of it, girl? You tend his boots, not his heart. Elara had felt her face flush but held her ground. I know that a man who takes care to wipe his boots before leaving them, who returns them to the same spot each evening, who has never once spoken harshly to me, despite whatever pain he carries, such a man deserves better than to be called a monster by those who have never done more than glimpse his shadow in a hallway. The ridicule that followed and had stung, the other servants making jokes about her defending her boot prints, suggesting with crude humor that perhaps she harbored aspirations above her station. But she had borne it silently and returned to the boot room, where at least the work was honest, and the boots told truer stories than gossip ever could. It was 2 days later that she found it a single silver coin placed carefully on the boot stand, balanced on its edge so that it caught the lamplight and sent small shivers of brightness across the stone walls. It was not payment, for her wages came through the head housekeeper in the usual manner, and the coin was too valuable by half for a simple tip. She picked it up with trembling fingers and understood it for what it was: acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude, a way of saying without words that he knew she had defended him, that her small act of loyalty in the kitchen had somehow reached his ears through the palace's invisible network of whispers and reports. She should have spent it, should have added it to the meager savings she kept hidden in her chamber against future need, but instead she threaded it on a piece of ribbon and wore it beneath her dress where it rested against her heart, a secret talisman of connection to a man whose face she had never seen but whose soul she was beginning, piece by careful piece, to understand. The second winter arrived with a vengeance that made the first seem merely a rehearsal for true cold, the kind that crept through stone walls and settled into bones, and that turned breath to fog and made each morning a battle against the desire to remain beneath whatever thin blankets one possessed. And with it came a change in the Duke's boots that troubled Elara in ways she could not quite name but felt nonetheless as a weight upon her chest when she lifted them each dawn. The mud was darker now, blacker, carrying the smell of places where water pooled and stagnated, where the earth had been churned by hooves in frantic passage, and the blood returned with a frequency that spoke of violence, or at least of danger, courted with deliberate intent, not the occasional spot of the previous year, but streaks and spatters that sometimes took her an hour to work free from the leather's grain. She worried, though she had no right to worry, no claim upon his safety or his choices, yet the worry persisted like a low fever, keeping her awake some nights as she wondered what drove him into such darkness, what pain or fury sent him riding through winter nights when sensible men kept to hearth and hall. The boots spoke of distances covered at speed, of long hours in the saddle that left the leather salt-stained from the horse's sweat, of paths chosen not for destination, but for the choosing itself, and she found herself whispering prayers to saints she barely believed in, asking them to watch over a man whose face she had never seen, but whose existence had somehow become tangled with her own in ways that defied the logic of station and circumstance. It was on an evening in late December, when darkness fell before the afternoon had properly ended, and the wind howled around the palace towers like something alive and hungry, that he arrived early, so early that she was still bent over his boots with cloth and oil, humming softly a tune her mother had taught her years ago, before the war, before the world had narrowed to this small room and its rituals. She heard his footsteps and fell silent, straightening quickly, cloth still in hand, a flush rising to her cheeks at being caught in such an unguarded moment. But he paused in the doorway longer than usual, his tall frame backlit by the corridor's torches, the silver mask catching points of light and scattering them. "You were humming," he said, and his voice was different than she had heard it before, less the gruff command of their previous exchanges and more something curious, almost uncertain, as though he too had been caught off guard and was not quite sure how to proceed. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she managed, setting down the cloth and dropping into a curtsy deeper than usual, hoping to cover her embarrassment with formality. "I did not expect you so early. I have not finished." "No," he interrupted, stepping into the room properly for the first time, making it feel suddenly smaller, the air between them charged with something she could not name. "I meant it was a pleasant sound. The tune, I mean. My mother used to hum something similar, before," and here he stopped, seeming to think better of whatever confession had nearly escaped him. "What is it called?" She looked up then, really looked at him for the first time beyond mere glances stolen during their brief exchanges, and saw his eyes through the mask's openings, grey as winter storms. Yes, but not unkind, holding something that might have been loneliness, or might have been a tentative reaching toward connection. And in that moment, something shifted between them. Some invisible line crossed. "The shepherd's daughter," she said softly, her hands still now, the boots forgotten between them like witnesses to this first true exchange of words that carried weight beyond mere transaction. And when he nodded slowly, as though committing the name to memory, she knew without knowing how she knew that something had begun, that neither of them could have named, but both of them felt fragile as new ice and just as treacherous. It began with a book left behind, perhaps by accident or perhaps with intention she could not discern, a slim volume of poetry bound in worn leather that rested atop the boot stand one evening when she arrived to collect his boots, and she had picked it up with careful fingers, intending to set it aside for his return, but her eyes caught on an open page, and she found herself reading a verse about winter and loneliness, about the cold that seeps not into bone but into soul, and something in those words pierced her so deeply that she stood there reading until the lamps needed lighting, and her work was barely half done. She left it where she had found it with a scrap of paper, marking another page, a different poem about spring's eventual arrival, about hope being the thing that survives beneath frozen ground, waiting, and when he came that night, he said nothing, but his eyes found the marked page, and lingered there before he took up his boots and departed. And she wondered if she had overstepped, presumed too much, but the next week another book appeared, this one of philosophy, and this time she was certain it was no accident, for it lay open to a passage about the masks men wear and the faces they hide, and so their dialogue without words began in earnest. The books accumulated slowly across the weeks that followed, volumes that spoke of subjects both weighty and whimsical, histories and fables, treatises on governance and collections of folk tales, and she devoured them all in the hours between her duties, reading by lamplight in her small chamber, or in the boot room itself while she worked, and always she left them with pages marked, sometimes at passages she agreed with, and sometimes at those she questioned, and gradually she began to leave small notes written in her careful script on whatever scraps of paper she could find, brief thoughts that responded to the ideas she found within, and he began to answer in the margins themselves, his writing bold and sure, creating conversations that existed only on paper but felt more real than any she had ever spoken aloud. The palace noticed changes in the Duke that winter, remarking among themselves that his grace seemed less withdrawn, that he had begun to attend certain court functions again, that his temper had gentened, and his voice, when he gave orders, carried less of the harsh edge that had characterized his speech since the war. And they attributed this transformation to various causes, some claiming that Lady Mathilde had caught his eye at the midwinter feast, others insisting it was the widow countess from the northern provinces, whose letters arrived with such frequency, and Elara heard all this gossip and said nothing, keeping her silence as she kept the silver coin, close and secret, treasuring the knowledge that she alone knew the truth of what had shifted in him, that it was not any lady of court who had reached him, but rather a servant girl who spoke to him through marked passages and marginal notes, who understood that sometimes the deepest conversations happen in the spaces between spoken words, in the careful selection of which thoughts to share and which to hold back, in the gradual revelation of self that comes not through grand declarations, but through the accumulated weight of small truths offered and received in turn, and she found herself living for those evenings when she would find a new book waiting, found herself composing responses in her mind throughout the day while she worked, crafting arguments and observations she hoped might interest him, might make him see her not as the boot girl he hired, but as a mind worthy of engagement, a soul capable of meeting his own, in those places where station and appearance meant nothing, and only the content of thought and feeling mattered. The third winter descended upon the palace with a brutality that seemed almost personal, as though the sky itself had declared war upon the earth, and with it came a cold that settled into the boot room despite the stones and walls, a penetrating chill that made Elara's fingers ache, even through the gloves she wore while working, made her breath hang visible in the air like small ghosts of words unspoken, and she found herself coughing more frequently as the weeks passed, a dry rasp that she tried to suppress during the Duke's visits, but which grew worse in the early mornings when she first arrived to begin her work, her chest tight and her head growing increasingly light with a fever she could not afford to acknowledge, because servants who fell ill were servants who lost their positions, and so she pushed through the mounting exhaustion, the chills that racked her body, even as she worked near the small brazier, the growing weakness in her limbs that made even the simple task of lifting his boots feel like moving mountains, until one morning she simply could not rise from her bed, could not force her body to obey her will no matter how she commanded it, and she lay in the cramped servants' quarters, burning with fever, while her mind wandered through strange landscapes populated by silver masks and books that spoke in voices she almost recognized. She was not conscious when the Duke arrived that evening to find the boot room empty, his boots still mud-caked from the morning's ride, no lamp lit against the gathering darkness, no sign of the girl who had become as much a part of his daily rhythm as breathing. And those who witnessed his reaction would later speak of it in hushed tones, how he had stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, before demanding in a voice that carried the edge of something very near to panic, where she was, why she had not come, and when the head of household staff attempted to explain that she was merely a servant girl, taken with fever, and therefore of no concern to his grace, he had cut the explanation short, with words that left no room for argument, ordering that the palace physician attend her immediately, that she be moved to better quarters, that no expense be spared for her care, and the shock that rippled through the palace at this unprecedented attention, shown to one so far beneath his station, set tongues wagging with renewed fervor, speculation running wild about what services she must have provided to earn such favor, what secrets she must hold to command such concern, and through it all, Ilara knew nothing, lost in fever dreams, where she polished boots that bled, and books that dissolved into ash when she tried to read them, where a voice she recognized kept asking her to stay, to hold on, to come back. When the fever finally broke 4 days later, and she woke weak but clear-headed in a room she did not recognize, warmer and cleaner than any she had ever inhabited, she learned from the physician's assistant that the Duke had sent hourly inquiries about her condition, had paced the corridors outside her door, though protocol forbade him from entering, had personally ensured that she received every comfort and care that could be provided, and this knowledge settled into her heart with a weight that was both joy and terror, for she understood what it meant and what it could cost them both if others understood it too. A week passed before she was strong enough to return to her duties, and when she finally made her way back to the boot room on unsteady legs, she found it transformed. A proper heating stove had been installed in the corner, its iron surface radiating blessed warmth throughout the small space. A cushioned chair sat beside her work table, where before she had stood or knelt on bare stone, and a thick wool blanket lay folded across its back, and she stood there with tears streaming down her cheeks, not from the illness, but from the overwhelming tenderness of these gestures, from the care implicit in each addition, from the knowledge that while she had lain fevered and unknowing, he had thought of her comfort, had moved the world in small ways to ensure she would not suffer such cold again. And she understood then with a clarity that pierced deeper than any fever that what existed between them had moved beyond the bounds of books and boots, beyond the careful distance they had maintained, into territory far more dangerous and infinitely more precious than either of them had intended to tread. He came late one night, 3 weeks after her recovery, when the palace had settled into its evening quiet, and the boot room existed in that suspended space between day's end and night's dominion. And she heard his footsteps approaching with the familiar cadence she had learned to recognize across 3 winters. But this time they did not pause at the threshold as they usually did, and did not hesitate with that brief moment of preparation before entering. And when he appeared in the doorway, something in his bearing was different, less guarded perhaps, or more determined. She could not quite discern which, and without preamble he crossed to the chair he had installed for her comfort and sat, a gesture so unprecedented that her hands stilled mid-polish, and she looked up at him with questions in her eyes that she did not voice. "Tell me about yourself," he said, and his voice carried none of its usual formality, none of the careful distance he typically maintained, and the request was so direct, so unexpected, that for a moment she could not find words to answer. But he waited with a patience that spoke of genuine interest rather than mere courtesy, and so she began haltingly to speak of her childhood, in a village whose name no longer appeared on any map because the war had erased it as thoroughly as fire erases kindling, of parents who had loved her fiercely in the brief years she had known them, of the journey to the palace as an orphan of 11 with nothing but the clothes she wore and a determination to survive that had sustained her through 6 years of service in positions that gradually improved until she found herself here, in this small room that had become the center of her world in ways she could never have anticipated. He listened without interruption, his grey eyes visible through the mask's openings, fixed upon her face with an intensity that made her simultaneously self-conscious and strangely liberated, as though being truly seen for the first time. And when she finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment before he said, "The war took your family as it took my face." And there was something raw in his voice, something undefended, and she understood that he was offering her a truth in exchange for the one she had given him, that they were negotiating a new territory between them, where the rules of station and circumstance held less power than the simple human need for connection, for being known. "Tell me about your days," she said softly, continuing her work on his boots, because the familiar motion gave her courage, and he began to speak of the weight of duty, of sitting in council meetings where men debated policies that would affect thousands while treating him with a deference that was fear poorly disguised as respect, of walking through halls where conversations stopped at his approach and eyes slid away from his masked face, of the exhausting performance of appearing unmoved by the isolation that defined his existence, and his words painted a picture of loneliness so profound that it made her own years of solitude seem almost companionable by comparison, for at least she had been lonely among people who saw her, even if they saw her as beneath their notice, whereas he was lonely among people who could not bear to see him at all. And she understood then that the mask was not merely covering his scars, but had become a barrier between him and every human connection he might have formed, a wall built as much by others' revulsion as by his own protective instinct. "I am defined entirely by what I have lost," he said, and there was a weariness in the words that spoke of years spent carrying this burden, by the face that was burned away, by the life that ended on that battlefield, by all the futures that died when the flames took my features, and I wonder sometimes if there is anything left beneath the loss, anything that could be called truly mine, rather than merely the absence of what once was. And she heard in this confession the heart of his pain, the question that haunted him in the dark hours when even the mask could not protect him from his own thoughts. And she set down the boot she had been polishing and met his eyes with a steadiness she had not known she possessed, and said quietly, "You are here, breathing, thinking, feeling, and that is not loss but presence, not absence but existence, and perhaps the question is not what remains but what you choose to build from what you have." And she saw something shift in his expression, a crack in the armor of despair he wore beneath the silver mask, and the silence that fell between them then was not empty but full, pregnant with possibilities neither of them dared yet to name. Spring arrived that third year with a gentleness that seemed almost apologetic after the harshness of winter, bringing with it longer days and softer light that filtered through the high window of the boot room and transformed the space into something almost golden in the evenings. And with the changing season came a shift in the rhythm of their encounters, for what had begun as a single late-night conversation became 2, then 3, and then evolved into an unspoken expectation that he would come to her each evening after his duties were concluded, would settle into the chair that had become his customary place and speak with her while she worked, their dialogue ranging across territories both vast and intimate, touching upon philosophy and poetry and the nature of loss with an ease that surprised them both. He spoke of the ancient texts he had studied in his youth, of Stoic philosophers who counseled acceptance of fate and romantic poets who elevated emotion above reason, and she listened with an attention that was more than polite interest, contributing observations that revealed a mind honed sharp by hardship and contemplation, a wisdom born not from formal education, but from the profound teacher that suffering can be when one chooses to learn from it rather than be destroyed by it. And he found himself astonished by her insights, by the grace with which she articulated truths that resonated in the deepest chambers of his understanding, and he realized with a start that pierced through years of assumptions that intelligence and worth had nothing to do with station or education, but were inherent qualities that manifested regardless of circumstance. She spoke of small beauties she had observed in her years of service, the way morning light touched the palace stones, the patience required to restore something damaged to wholeness, the satisfaction of work well done even when no one noticed or cared, and in her words, he heard an appreciation for life that his own bitterness had long obscured, a capacity for finding meaning in the smallest moments that made his grand philosophical debates seem hollow by comparison, and he understood that she was teaching him something essential about the art of being human, about how survival was not merely enduring but choosing each day to notice, to care, to find purpose in whatever labor one's hands could perform. The physical space between them began to collapse by increments so small that neither could have said when it started, when the careful distance he maintained, while handing her his boots, began to close until their fingers would brush in the exchange, the contact lasting a fraction longer than necessity required, or when he began to lean forward in his chair as she spoke, drawn by some gravity he could not name toward the quiet radiance she emanated, or when she found herself working at the table nearest to where he sat, rather than in her usual corner, arranging their proximity with an unconscious choreography that spoke of desires neither had yet acknowledged aloud. There were moments when the conversation would pause, and they would exist in silence together, her hands moving through their familiar work, while his eyes followed the motion with an attention that was no longer merely observation, but something approaching reverence. And in those suspended instances, the boot room became a world entire unto itself, a sanctuary where the rules that governed the palace beyond its door held no dominion, where a duke and a servant girl could simply be two people, finding in each other a recognition that transcended every boundary that circumstance had placed between them, and though neither spoke of what was growing between them, both felt it like a seed, pushing toward light, fragile and inevitable, and terrifying in its implications. The fourth winter arrived with a cruelty that seemed personal, winds howling through the palace corridors as though seeking to extinguish every warmth that dared exist within those ancient stones, and with it came a change in the atmosphere of the court that Ilara felt even from her position in the servants' quarters, whispers that reached her ears through the complex network of gossip that threaded through the palace like veins through a body, carrying news both trivial and momentous to every corner where those who served lived their invisible lives. The king had issued an ultimatum, she learned from the head housekeeper who had heard it from the chamberlain who had been present in the throne room when the decree was made, that the duke must marry before the spring thaw, or a bride would be chosen for him, a command born not of cruelty but of practical necessity, for the duchy required an heir, and the duke was past 30 with no prospect of producing one, and though the servants spoke of it as court politics, Ilara heard in their words the death knell of something precious and undefined that had been growing in the boot room through months of evening conversations and shared silences. The parade began in the first week of November, noble ladies arriving from every corner of the realm and beyond, daughters of counts and earls and foreign dignitaries, each announced with fanfare and escorted through the palace halls with an entourage that spoke of their importance and their families' ambitions, and Ilara watched from the shadows as they passed, these women in their finery with their perfect faces and practiced graces, everything she was not and could never be, and felt a hollowness open in her chest that had nothing to do with envy and everything to do with the terrible understanding that what existed between her and the duke, whatever name it might have claimed had circumstances been different, was impossible in a world governed by bloodlines and propriety. She witnessed his despair not through his words, for he stopped coming to the boot room with the regularity that had become their custom, his visits growing sporadic and brief, but through his boots, which told the story his absence could not hide, the leather scuffed and damaged in ways that spoke of long, reckless rides through dangerous terrain, the kind of desperate movement that seeks to outrun thoughts too painful to endure. And she cleaned them with hands that trembled slightly, wondering which of the perfect ladies would claim him, which would become mistress of these halls and mother to his children, which would sleep beside him in the great bed and never know the man she had come to understand through years of patient observation. The meetings were brief by design, she learned, the Duke receiving each candidate in the formal drawing room for no more than a quarter hour, always masked, always rigidly polite, and each departed quickly afterward, some with barely concealed relief, others with disappointment that their beauty and breeding had not been sufficient to overcome whatever lay beneath that silver mask, and Ilara found herself caught between hoping they would all reject him, preserving the fragile thing between them for a few moments longer, and hoping one would see past the surface to the extraordinary soul beneath, would give him the companionship and legitimacy she never could, would end his loneliness, even if it meant ending her own heart in the process. He came to her late one night in the third week of this procession, appearing in the boot room doorway with a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion, and sat in his chair without speaking for long minutes while she worked, the silence between them no longer comfortable but heavy with everything they could not say, until finally he spoke in a voice so low she had to still her hands to hear him, and said, "The mask is both protection and prison." Words that seemed torn from some deep place he had kept locked even from himself, and she understood he was speaking not just of the silver that covered his face, but of every defense he had constructed against a world that had taught him. His appearance was monstrous, every wall he had built to survive in a position that required strength while offering only isolation. And she saw in that moment the full measure of his captivity, how he could not remove the mask without watching hope die in others' eyes, could not reveal himself without becoming again the horror that had sent a princess fleeing, could not be known except in shadows and through the filter of metal, and her heart broke for him in ways that made her previous sorrows seem like minor griefs. For his prison was inescapable, built by the very face he could not change, and she had no key to offer him, no words that could unlock doors barred by forces beyond either of their control. The silence that followed his confession stretched between them like a chasm, filled with all the weight of impossibility and despair, until Ilara found within herself a courage she had not known she possessed, born perhaps from the accumulated strength of 5 winters spent in quiet labor, or from the simple fact that she could no longer bear to watch him suffer in a prison of his own construction, and she set down the boot she had been holding, her hands stilling in their familiar work as she turned to face him fully, and said in a voice that trembled only slightly, "Faces are merely the covers of books, Your Grace, and what matters is the story written within." He looked at her then with those grey eyes visible through the mask's openings, and she saw in them a flicker of something that might have been hope before cynicism reasserted itself, and he replied with a bitterness that did not quite conceal the longing beneath. "A pretty sentiment, but the world judges books by their covers, as you well know, and mine has proven sufficient to send even those bred to duty fleeing from the prospect of reading further." She might have retreated then, might have accepted his despair as the final word on the matter, but something in his tone told her he wanted to be challenged, wanted someone to fight against the walls he had built, even as he defended them, and so she took a step closer, her simple servant's dress rustling in the quiet room, and said with a conviction that surprised them both, "Then the world is peopled by fools, who miss the finest stories for want of courage. But I am not the world, Your Grace, and I have read your story through 5 winters of boots that told me where you walked and how heavily the weight of duty pressed upon you. Through books you left for me with passages marked that revealed a soul hungry for beauty and meaning, through words exchanged in this room that showed me a mind, brilliant and wounded, and striving towards something better than mere survival. And I know your character, sir. I know it better than any of those ladies who saw only your mask and could not imagine the man behind it. Know it in ways that have nothing to do with the accident of features, and everything to do with the deliberate choices you make each day about who you will be despite everything that has been done to you." The words tumbled from her like water long dammed, suddenly released, carrying with them years of observation and growing feeling she had never permitted herself to name, and she saw him rise from his chair, saw his hands clench and unclench at his sides, as though he were fighting some internal battle. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion barely contained. "You speak of knowing me," he said, "but you have never seen me, not truly. Not the ruin that war made of a face that was never handsome, but was at least human before fire and blade rewrote it into something that makes children cry and women faint, and brave men look away in pity or disgust." She held his gaze steadily, refusing to let him hide behind the horror he believed himself to be, and replied with a gentleness that was also somehow fierce, "I have seen you in every way that matters, have seen your kindness in the physician you sent when I fell ill, your consideration in the warmth you ordered for this room, your loneliness in the way you linger at thresholds as though afraid to fully enter any space, your hope in the books you shared, as though testing whether I might understand the passages that moved you, your strength in shoulders that carry burdens you never chose but refuse to abandon. And if you think the particular arrangement of features can diminish or enhance what I have witnessed of your soul through 5 years of patient knowing, then you understand nothing of how I see you, nothing of what vision truly means when it looks past surfaces to the truth beneath. She watched something crack in his expression, some ancient defense beginning to crumble, and knew she had reached him in a place that perhaps no one had touched since the war had remade him, had spoken to the part of him that still hoped to be known and valued despite the mask he wore, both literally and metaphorically. And in that moment, the boot room became sacred space, a confessional where truth could be spoken between two people who had earned the right to such honesty through years of small kindnesses and growing trust. And whatever came after, she would not regret having offered him this gift of being truly seen. The fourth winter deepened with a quality of stillness that felt like held breath, as though the palace itself waited to see what would emerge from the conversation that had occurred in the boot room. And in the days that followed, Ilara noticed a subtle shift in the Duke's behavior, a change that manifested not in grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but in the quiet language of consideration they had developed over years of careful knowing. And she found when she arrived for her work one morning that new gloves lay folded on the boot stand, fine leather lined with rabbit fur, far too expensive for a servant but sized perfectly for her hands, and beside them a small bottle of oil for the leather work, better quality than what the household provided. And when she looked up, she saw him watching from the doorway, with an expression she could not quite read through the mask, but which softened the hard lines of his posture into something almost vulnerable. He began arriving earlier in the evenings, staying longer, their conversations ranging across subjects both profound and mundane, and she learned that he had opinions about everything, from the proper way to train horses to the philosophical implications of free will, that he could quote poetry in 3 languages and debate theology with the passion of a scholar, and in turn she offered her own observations born from a life lived close to the earth and necessity, wisdom earned through hardship that sometimes surprised him into silence, followed by thoughtful consideration. And she saw how he valued her mind as much as her kindness, how he listened to her words with an attention that made her feel seen in ways she had never experienced, as though her thoughts mattered, as though she mattered beyond her function in his household. The head servant, a woman named Mrs. Kellen, whose cruelty was masked by efficiency and whose domain was the ordering of the household staff with an iron hand, came to the boot room one afternoon and demanded to know why valuable fuel was being wasted, heating a space where a single servant worked, her voice sharp with the particular disdain those with small power reserve for those with less, and Ilara had begun to stammer an apology when the Duke's voice cut across the room like a blade, appearing from wherever he had been reviewing accounts in the adjacent study, his tone carrying an authority that made the older woman blanch, and he informed Mrs. Kellen that the boot room would remain heated by his explicit order, that the servant who worked there performed duties essential to his comfort and would do so in conditions he deemed appropriate, and the head servant retreated with barely concealed resentment, while Ilara stood frozen, unused to being defended, unused to her welfare being considered worth a Duke's intervention. And when Mrs. Kellen had gone, he turned to her and said simply, "You should not have to freeze while you work." And she heard in those words all the things he could not say about caring for her comfort, about wanting her safe and warm, about the small ways he could protect her within the constraints that bound them both. Their relationship existed in a liminal space that defied easy definition. Neither master and servant in the traditional sense, nor friends exactly, certainly not the thing they might have been had circumstances been different, and yet it was real and growing, fed by evening conversations and shared silences, by books still exchanged with passages marked by the way their hands brushed when he delivered his boots, and lingered a moment longer than necessity required, and by looks that carried weight and meaning that would have been dangerous had anyone been observing closely enough to interpret them. And Ilara found herself living for those evening hours in the boot room, found that the rest of her days had become merely the time she endured until she could return to that warm space where she was seen and valued, where she could be herself rather than simply a servant fulfilling a function. And she knew this was dangerous, knew she was allowing herself to feel things that could only lead to pain, given the impossible gulf between their stations, and yet she could not seem to stop the tender growth of feeling that bloomed in her chest like flowers forcing their way through winter snow, and persistent and beautiful, and ultimately doomed by forces beyond her control to wither before they could properly flourish. The summons came on a morning when frost painted the palace windows with crystalline patterns that might have been beautiful had they not heralded the arrival of winter's deepest cold, and with it a decree from the king that shattered the fragile sanctuary Elara and the duke had built in their evenings together. For his majesty had grown impatient with his son's continued unmarried state, and declared that a bride must be chosen by spring or one would be selected for him, and to facilitate this conclusion, a grand ball would be held in 6 weeks' time, an announcement that spread through the palace like wildfire, and brought with it a flurry of preparations that transformed the ancient halls into something resembling a military campaign, with seamstresses and florists and musicians all conscripted into service for an event that would showcase the duke to every eligible noblewoman within 3 kingdoms. And Elara heard the news from the other servants, who spoke of it with excitement, tinged with curiosity about whether any lady would accept a masked duke, regardless of his title and lands, their speculation cutting into her with the sharp precision of a knife between ribs, though she kept her face carefully neutral and continued her work with hands that trembled only when no one was watching. And that evening, when the appointed hour came for the duke's usual visit to the boot-room, she waited with a hope she knew was foolish, polishing leather that was already gleaming, while the fire crackled in the hearth he had ordered, built for her comfort. But he did not come, and the next evening he did not come, and as days became weeks, she understood that he had made his choice, had retreated behind the walls of duty and impossibility, had recognized what she had always known in her heart, even as she had allowed herself to hope otherwise, that whatever had grown between them in this warm room could not survive the harsh light of reality, and could not bridge the chasm between a duke who must secure his lineage and a servant girl whose only value lay in her labor. And so she continued her work alone, arrived each evening to find his boots waiting on the stand, placed there by some other hand, now, the leather still muddy and worn but somehow emptier for the absence of the moment when he would deliver them himself, when their fingers might brush and eyes might meet and something unspoken but profound would pass between them, and she polished them as she always had, with care and attention and a growing ache in her chest that made breathing difficult, and sometimes as she worked, she found that tears had fallen onto the leather, salt mixing with oil to create a polish born of grief as much as skill, and she would wipe them away quickly, ashamed of this evidence of feeling, this proof that she had been foolish enough to imagine that kindness meant something more, that conversations in a boot-room could somehow translate into a future that defied every rule of the world they inhabited, and the palace around her buzzed with preparations for the ball, with gossip about which ladies would attend, and speculation about which might be brave enough or ambitious enough to accept a scarred duke, and Elara listened to it all with a stillness that was mistaken for indifference, but was actually the frozen surface of deep water, calm above and churning below, and she understood with a clarity that was also a kind of death, that she had allowed herself to love someone forever beyond her reach, had given her heart to a man who belonged to duty and dynasty, and the inexorable demands of his station, and the boots she polished each night became her penance and her prayer, the only connection that remained to those evenings when she had been seen and valued, and had foolishly believed that such seeing might be enough to overcome the weight of centuries of tradition and the unbridgeable distance between their worlds. The night before the ball arrived with the weight of an ending, the palace glittering with preparations that mocked the despair Elara carried in her chest as she entered the boot-room for what she believed might be the final time, for surely after tomorrow, when the duke chose his bride from among the noble ladies assembled for his inspection, there would be no more need for evening visits or shared silences or any of the small intimacies that had sustained her through these weeks of absence, and she had resigned herself to this loss with the stoic acceptance born of a life that had taught her early not to expect kindness to last, was settling into her work with mechanical precision when the door opened and he was there. The duke, his silver mask catching the firelight as he entered, with movements that spoke of barely contained agitation, and he began to pace the small room like a caged animal, 3 steps to the window, turn, 3 steps to the door, turn again, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides while she watched in silence and waited for whatever had brought him here on this night of all nights. And finally, he stopped and turned to her and began to speak, the words tumbling out in a torrent that seemed to have been building behind a dam of will and duty for too long. And he spoke of the cage of his station, of being born to a life where every choice was predetermined by bloodlines and alliances, and the need to secure succession, where his wants and desires were irrelevant against the weight of dynasty and tradition. And he spoke of the cruelty of fate that had allowed him to know connection with the one person forever denied him by the accident of birth and circumstance, that had shown him what it meant to be seen and valued for himself rather than his title, only to place that recognition in the hands of someone he could never claim without destroying her reputation and his own position. And his voice carried a rawness she had never heard before, a desperation that stripped away the careful control he usually maintained. And he said that tomorrow he would stand before the court and choose a bride as duty demanded. He would bind himself to some lady who would accept his scars and his title in exchange for status and wealth, and would live out his days in a marriage of political convenience, while knowing that the person who truly understood him worked in his boot room, polishing leather, and the injustice of it burned in his words like acid, the rage at a world that valued blood over character and position over genuine feeling. And when he finally fell silent, the room seemed to ring with the echo of his confession, and Elara stood slowly, set down the boot she had been holding, and crossed to where he stood trembling with the force of emotions too long suppressed. And she looked up at the silver mask that hid his face, but could not hide the storm-grey eyes that watched her with something that looked like both hope and despair. And she asked in a voice that was steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs, "What do you want? Beneath all the armor of obligation, beneath the weight of duty and the demands of your station, what do you truly want?" And the question hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, an invitation to speak the truth that both of them had been dancing around for months. And she saw his hands shake as he raised them to his mask, saw the moment of decision in the set of his shoulders, and she waited to hear what he would say when all the walls came down. The Duke's hands moved to his mask with a finality that spoke of a decision made, and his voice, when he answered her question, carried the weight of a truth too long imprisoned. "You, Elara, I want you, and I know the absurdity of it, the impossibility of a duke desiring a servant girl, the madness of allowing my heart to settle on the one person in all the kingdom I cannot have without bringing scandal upon both our heads. But I am weary of pretending that duty is enough, and that I can bind myself to a stranger and live contentedly, knowing that the person who sees me truly works in my boot room. And I confess this, knowing it changes nothing, knowing that tomorrow I must still choose a bride from among ladies who will endure my face for the sake of my title. But I cannot go to that ball without you knowing that you are what I want, that these months of conversation have been the only honest moments of my life, that your presence has been both my salvation and my torment." And as he spoke, his fingers found the clasps that held the silver mask in place, and Elara's breath caught in her throat as she understood what he was about to do, what gift of trust and vulnerability he was offering even as he declared its futility. And she wanted to tell him to stop and to spare himself the pain of revealing what he believed would drive her away. But she also understood that this was necessary, that some truths could only be spoken when all barriers were removed, and so she watched in silence as he lifted the mask away and stood before her, fully revealed for the first time, his face marked by the savage beauty of survival and scars that ran like rivers across skin that had been remade by fire and blade, tissue that had healed in ridges and valleys that spoke of agony, endured and overcome. And he stood utterly still as he watched her face, waiting for the recoil that had greeted every other revelation of his appearance, the subtle flinch or poorly concealed horror that had taught him to keep the mask in place. And she saw in his eyes the expectation of rejection, the certainty that even she, even after all their months of connection, would fail this final test of genuine seeing. But Elara felt no horror as she looked at him, only a fierce tenderness for the courage it took to stand unmasked before her, only gratitude that he would trust her with this vulnerability, and she stepped forward slowly, giving him time to retreat if he wished. And when he remained frozen, She raised her hands and touched his face with fingers that trembled not from revulsion, but from the profound intimacy of the gesture, traced the scars with a gentleness that honored rather than pitied them, followed the paths of old wounds with fingertips that learned the map of his survival, and she said in a voice that was steady and sure despite the tears that gathered in her eyes, "I see you, all of you, and I find you beautiful not despite these marks but because of them, because they speak of a life lived rather than hidden, of pain endured and overcome, of a man who survived what would have destroyed others and emerged with kindness still intact, with the capacity to value a servant girl's conversation and to find refuge in a boot room. And if you believe these scars make you less worthy of love, then you understand nothing of what I have learned in 5 winters of polishing your boots, of reading the books you left for me, and of treasuring every word we have exchanged, for I have come to know your character through these small intimacies, and that character is worthy of everything, is beautiful and true and infinitely precious regardless of the face that houses it." And she saw something break open in his expression, some dam of certainty giving way to wonder, and his hands came up to cover hers where they rested against his scarred cheeks, and he whispered, "You truly mean it." And she answered, "I have never meant anything more," and in that moment the impossibility of their situation seemed less absolute than it had moments before, seemed something that might be overcome by the force of what had been acknowledged between them. The kiss, when it came, was inevitable as sunrise, gentle and searching as though they were learning a new language together, and Elara felt the tremor in his scarred hands as they framed her face with a reverence that spoke of wonder and disbelief, and she pressed closer to him in the small boot room that had witnessed the slow unfolding of their connection, surrounded by the scent of leather and oil, and the earthiness of the boots that had brought them together across the chasm of station and circumstance. And when they finally drew apart, he rested his forehead against hers and whispered that he had dreamed of this moment in the dark hours, when duty seemed an insurmountable wall, had imagined what it might feel like to be accepted completely by someone who knew him truly, and she could feel the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palm, where it rested against his chest, could sense the transformation occurring within him as despair gave way to something that looked remarkably like hope. And he said that he could not marry another now, could not stand before the court tomorrow and choose a bride when his heart had already made its choice. But neither could he simply elevate a servant to duchess without causing a scandal that would harm her far more than it would damage him, for the court would view her as an opportunist who had seduced him for position, would make her life unbearable with whispers and accusations, and the subtle cruelties that nobility employed against those who rose above their station. And he would not subject her to such treatment even if it meant losing her, and Elara listened to his careful reasoning with a patience born of 5 winters, spent learning to read the stories his boots told. And then she spoke with a clarity that surprised them both, said that she did not need protection from scandal, that she had lived her entire life beneath the notice of those who would now judge her, and had learned that their opinions held no power unless she granted it to them, that what mattered was not the court's approval, but the truth of what existed between them. And she asked him plainly whether he loved her enough to face whatever consequences might come from claiming her publicly, whether he possessed the courage to stand before king and court and declare that he had chosen his bride, not from political calculation, but from genuine feeling. And she watched as something shifted in his expression, being a hardening of resolve that replaced uncertainty with determination. And he said that he had spent years hiding behind a mask to spare others discomfort, had allowed fear of judgment to dictate how he lived, but he would not hide what he felt for her, would not allow the opinions of those who valued bloodlines over character to keep him from the one genuine connection he had found in a life marked by isolation and loss, and he would go to the ball tomorrow, not to choose from among the noble ladies assembled for his inspection, but to claim her before all of them, and to remove his mask, and stand revealed and vulnerable, and ask her to be his duchess, regardless of scandal or outrage or political consequences. And if the king disapproved, then he would renounce his title and live as a common man with her. Seven would choose love over duty and accept whatever exile or punishment such choice might bring, and Elara saw in his storm-grey eyes the absolute conviction of his words, saw that he meant every promise he was making in this small room that smelled of leather and devotion, and she kissed him again to seal the decision they had made together. To mark this moment, when they chose each other despite all the forces arrayed against such choosing, and the future that had seemed impossibly closed only hours before, now opened before them, like a door swinging wide, to reveal a path neither had dared to imagine they might walk together. The grand ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles that cast dancing shadows across walls hung with tapestries depicting ancient victories, and the assembled nobility glittered in silks and jewels that spoke of wealth accumulated over generations, their faces arranged in expressions of anticipation and speculation as they awaited the Duke's arrival and his promised announcement of a chosen bride, and the air hummed with whispered wagers about which lady would be elevated to duchess, which family would gain the prestige and political advantage of such an alliance, and none among them suspected that their carefully constructed expectations were about to shatter like glass struck by stone. For in a small antechamber off the servants' corridor, Ilara stood trembling in a gown of simple blue silk that the Duke had commissioned for her, attended by 2 elderly servants who had served his family for decades, and who alone, among the palace staff, had been entrusted with the truth of what was about to occur, and they dressed her hair with gentle hands and whispered encouragement that she clung to like a lifeline, as terror and hope warred within her breast. And then the doors to the ballroom opened, and the Duke entered masked as always, his silver face catching the candlelight as he moved through the assembled crowd with the bearing of a man who had made a decision from which there could be no retreat. And the room fell silent as he ascended the dais, where the king sat watching with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts, and the Duke's voice when he spoke carried clearly through the vast space, formal and measured as he announced that he had indeed chosen his bride as commanded, that he would fulfill his duty to secure the succession and bind himself in marriage, but not to any of the noble ladies who had been paraded before him these past months, and confusion rippled through the crowd like wind across water, as courtiers exchanged glances and whispered speculations, and then the Duke gestured to the servants' entrance, and Ilara appeared at the threshold with her heart hammering so violently she feared it might burst from her chest, and she walked forward through a corridor of shocked faces toward the man who stood waiting for her, with his hand extended, and gasps and exclamations erupted as the court recognized her as the servant girl from the boot room, as scandal made manifest, and she took his hand with fingers that shook despite her determination to appear calm, and together they turned to face the assembly as the Duke reached for the clasps of his mask and removed it in one fluid motion, standing revealed before all the kingdom's nobility with his scarred face bare to their scrutiny, and into the stunned silence that followed. He spoke in a voice that held no apology or shame, asked Ilara before king and court, and God if she would consent to be his wife, to bind her life to his despite the scandal such union would cause, despite the scars he bore and the whispers that would follow them, and he promised her nothing but his whole heart and the certainty that he would spend every day of their lives together, proving himself worthy of the gift she had already given him, by seeing him truly when all others looked away, and every eye in the ballroom fixed upon her as she stood before him in her simple blue gown, with her servant's hands clasped in his scarred ones, waiting for her answer to reshape the future of them all. Ilara's voice, when she spoke, carried through the ballroom with a clarity born not of volume, but of absolute conviction, and she said that she would be honored to accept his proposal, honored to stand beside him, not because he was a duke or because of any title he could bestow upon her, but because she had spent 5 winters learning the truth of who he was, through the boots he wore, and the books he shared, and the conversations they had conducted in a small room that smelled of leather and devotion, and she told the assembled court that faces were merely the covers of books, and that too many people spent their lives judging volumes by their bindings, without ever taking the time to read the stories written within, that she had been blessed with the opportunity to read his story slowly across seasons and years, and had found in those pages a man of profound honor and unexpected gentleness, a man who had survived horrors that would have broken lesser souls and emerged with his capacity for kindness intact, even if his face bore the scars of what he had endured. And she said that she saw him completely, saw both the wounds he carried and the strength that had allowed him to bear them, and she found him beautiful, not despite his scars, but because of the completeness they represented, the evidence of a life fully lived rather than carefully protected, and the simplicity of her words seemed to carry more weight than any elaborate speech might have done, for she spoke from the heart without artifice or calculation, and some among the assembled nobles shifted uncomfortably as her plain truth exposed the shallowness of their own judgments, while others found themselves moved despite their shock at the breach of propriety, for there was something undeniably genuine in the connection visible between the scarred duke and the servant girl, who looked at him as though he were the most precious thing in all the kingdom. And then the king rose from his throne with an expression that silenced the whispers rippling through the crowd, and all waited with held breath for his pronouncement, for his word would determine whether this unprecedented union would be permitted or forbidden, and he regarded his nephew with eyes that had witnessed decades of political marriages, contracted for advantage rather than affection, alliances forged through bloodlines rather than genuine feeling, and he saw in the duke's unveiled face a vulnerability and hope he had never witnessed in all the years since the young man had returned from war, wearing a mask and carrying wounds both visible and hidden, and the king said in a voice that resonated with authority and unexpected warmth that he had commanded his nephew to choose a bride and secure the succession, and choose he had, and who was the king to deny a match so clearly founded on mutual regard and genuine affection, when most noble marriages were little more than contracts negotiated between families for political gain, and he declared that if the duke vouched for this woman's character and intelligence, if he had found in her the qualities necessary to stand as his duchess and bear the responsibilities such position entailed, then the king would not stand in the way of their union regardless of her birth or station, for he had learned through long years of rule that character was not determined by bloodline, and that the accident of one's birth said nothing about the content of one's soul. And his approval sent a ripple of adjustment through the court, as those who had been prepared to voice outrage now found themselves forced to accept what their sovereign had sanctioned, though pockets of resistance remained visible in the expressions of certain noble families who viewed Ilara's elevation as a dangerous precedent that threatened the careful hierarchies upon which their power rested. But there were others, too, who had witnessed the duke's transformation over recent months, who had seen him emerge from isolation into gradual engagement with the world, and these understood that whatever the servant girl had done for him had accomplished what years of physicians and counselors had failed to achieve, and they offered tentative support born of pragmatism, if not enthusiasm, and through it all Ilara stood with her hand clasped in the duke's scarred one, steady despite the scrutiny of hundreds of eyes, drawing strength from the certainty that they had chosen each other freely and completely, and that no amount of scandal or whispered judgment could diminish the truth of what existed between them. Months later, when autumn painted the palace grounds in shades of amber and crimson, the wedding took place in the small chapel that had served the ducal family for generations, and Ilara had insisted upon intimacy over spectacle, despite the protests of court officials who envisioned a grand ceremony that would demonstrate the kingdom's acceptance of this unprecedented union. But she remained firm in her preference for simplicity, and the duke supported her choice, knowing that the sincerity of their vows mattered more than the number of witnesses present to hear them spoken, and so they were married before a gathering of perhaps 50 souls, including the king who gave the bride away, in absence of her own deceased father, the loyal servants who had first believed in their connection, and a carefully selected group of nobles whose support had proven genuine rather than merely politic, and the chapel filled with golden afternoon light that streamed through stained glass windows depicting saints and angels, and Ilara wore a gown of ivory silk that suited her far better than the elaborate confection the court dressmakers had initially proposed, her dark hair crowned with late-blooming roses from the palace gardens, and the duke stood beside her without his mask for the first time in a public ceremony, his scarred face visible to all who attended, and when he spoke his vows, his voice carried the weight of promises earned through patience rather than assumed through privilege. And Ilara's responses rang clear and certain, and there were tears among the witnesses, but they were tears of genuine emotion rather than social performance. And after the ceremony, there was a modest celebration in the palace gardens, where tables had been arranged beneath trees, already beginning to shed their leaves, and musicians played softly, and Ilara moved through the gathering with a grace that had nothing to do with noble training, and everything to do with the quiet dignity she had always possessed. And observant guests noted that while she had been transformed from servant to duchess, she had retained something essential in herself, a groundedness that no amount of silk and jewels could alter, and in the weeks and months that followed, this essential quality became her defining characteristic, as she learned to navigate the complexities of her new position, for she refused to simply ornament the Duke's life, but instead made herself useful in ways that confounded and sometimes irritated the established courtiers. She spent mornings in the palace gardens, working alongside the gardeners with her own hands in the soil. She visited the servants' quarters regularly and advocated for improvements in their living conditions. She sat in on the Duke's audiences and offered perspectives shaped by her years of observation from below, and slowly she earned a reputation not as the servant girl who had married above her station, but as a woman of genuine wisdom and practical compassion. And the Duke flourished under her influence in ways that astonished those who had known him before, for he began to move through the palace without the armor of his mask, accepting the stares and whispers of those still unaccustomed to his scarred face, with a dignity born of Ilara's unwavering regard, and he discovered that her acceptance had given him permission to accept himself, that her ability to see beauty in his completeness had taught him to recognize his own worth beyond the wounds he carried, and he learned to laugh again, to engage with the world without the barrier of silver that had separated him from genuine connection for so many years. And on quiet evenings they would retreat to their private chambers, and he would watch her brush out her hair before the mirror, and sometimes she would catch his gaze in the reflection and smile. And in those moments he understood that healing was not the erasure of scars, but the integration of them into a life lived fully despite and because of everything that had come before. 5 years passed like pages turning in a well-loved book, each season adding its own chapter to the story that had begun in a cold boot room with muddy leather and cautious hope. And the palace that had once felt like a mausoleum of isolation now rang with life and laughter, transformed not through grand renovations, but through the subtle alchemy of genuine happiness that seemed to seep into the very stones and brighten even the oldest corridors. And the Duke, who had once hidden behind silver and shadow, now moved through his domains with an ease that astonished those who remembered the masked recluse of earlier years, for he had become a man respected, not for his title or feared for his appearance, but valued for the wisdom he brought to council and the fairness with which he administered his lands, and his scarred face had become simply his face, remarkable only to strangers, while those who knew him saw past the damaged flesh to the thoughtful intelligence in his grey eyes and the gentle humor that played at the corners of his mouth when his children made him laugh. And yes, there were children now, 2 of them, with a third expected before winter, and they filled the palace with the particular chaos that only small humans can generate, their voices echoing through halls that had been silent for too long, their small feet pattering across floors that had once known only the measured tread of servants and the isolated pacing of a lonely duke. And the eldest was a daughter of 4 years named Catherine, who had inherited her father's grey eyes and her mother's quiet observation, and she adored her father with the uncomplicated devotion of a child who had never known a time when his scars were something to fear or pity, for to her they were simply part of him, like the deep timbre of his voice, or the way his hands could be gentle when he braided her hair, or firm when he lifted her onto his shoulders. And on this particular autumn afternoon, she had discovered her father's boots in the entrance hall, where he had left them after riding through the estate. And with the determination characteristic of small children who have decided upon a course of action, she had dragged them across the marble floor, leaving a trail of displaced rugs and the attention of several amused servants, until she reached the small room that had once been merely a boot room, but had been preserved as a sort of shrine to her parents' beginning. And there she found her mother already present, for Ilara still came to this room sometimes when she needed to think or remember the girl she had been before silk and titles had complicated her life. And Catherine announced with great seriousness that Papa's boots were dirty and needed cleaning, and could Mama teach her the proper way, because she was a big girl now, and big girls should know how to take care of important things. And Ilara felt her heart contract with the particular ache of joy mixed with memory as she looked at her daughter's earnest face, and then at the boots that were indeed muddy from the morning's ride. And she knelt beside Catherine and showed her how to hold the brush, how to work the oil into the leather with circular motions, how to pay attention to the seams where dirt accumulated. And as they worked together with Catherine's small hands guided by Ilara's more experienced ones, The Duke appeared in the doorway, drawn by reports of his daughter's determined boot-dragging expedition, and he stood watching his wife and child, bent over his boots in the room where everything had begun, and the sight filled him with such profound contentment that he had to pause and simply breathe through the intensity of it, for here was evidence of the life he had built from the ashes of isolation. Here was proof that patience, love, and courage to be seen could transform not just individuals but entire futures. And when Ilara looked up and caught his gaze, she smiled with an understanding that needed no words, for they both knew that they were watching their daughter learn more than boot polishing in this moment. They were passing on a legacy of seeing beneath surfaces and finding value in humble work, and understanding that care expressed through small, consistent actions often meant more than grand gestures. And Catherine looked up at her father with oil on her hands and pride in her eyes, and declared that his boots would be the shiniest in all the kingdom. And the Duke laughed and entered the room to kneel beside his daughter and his wife. And together the three of them completed the task, while beyond the boot-room windows the autumn sun painted everything golden and promised that winter, when it came, would be warm with the fires of family and bright with the light of love that had been earned through patience and preserved through grace. That evening, after Catherine had been tucked into bed with stories and kisses, and the younger children settled in the nursery under their nurse's watchful care, the Duke and Ilara returned to the boot-room, as had become their custom on quiet nights when they needed to reconnect with the simplicity of their beginning, and they sat together on the bench that had been added years ago, his arm around her shoulders and her head resting against the place where his heart beat steady and sure, and they talked, as they always did in this space, about the strange and wonderful path that had led them from those first fearful encounters to this evening of domestic contentment, and the Duke remarked that he could still remember the terror he had felt in those early days when the boot-room had been his only connection to ordinary human kindness, and Ilara's careful hands on his boots had seemed like a judgment he awaited each day, and she reminded him that she had been equally terrified, assigned to serve the monster of palace legend, and discovering instead a man imprisoned by circumstances and other people's fear, and they spoke of the patience required to build trust when both parties had been so thoroughly wounded by the world, of the courage it had taken to continue showing up day after day, season after season, without any guarantee that the small gestures and careful observations would ever amount to anything more than a servant's duty and a nobleman's courtesy. And the Duke touched the coin she still kept in a silver frame on the mantel of their private chambers, the first acknowledgment he had given that she was more than invisible hands performing invisible labor, and Ilara traced the scar along his jaw with fingers that had long since mapped every mark on his skin until they had become as familiar as the features of her own face, and in the gentle lamplight of the boot-room, with the smell of leather and oil still present. After all these years, they understood that they were not merely remembering their past, but honoring it as the foundation of everything they had, built together, and the Duke rose and retrieved his boots from where Catherine had left them, now properly polished and gleaming, and he held them for a moment, considering the weight of all they represented, before setting them carefully on the stand. And then he turned to his wife and took her hands, and they stood together in silence that required no words, because they had learned long ago that the deepest communication often happened in the spaces between speech. Dear listener, perhaps you wonder why I have shared this story of boots and patience and love that grew in the least likely of places, and it is because we live in an age that prizes the immediate and the obvious while overlooking the quiet transformations that happen when we dare to see beyond surfaces and sit with what makes us uncomfortable long enough to discover humanity beneath. For the Duke's scars were visible and therefore easy to judge or fear, but we all carry our own disfigurements hidden beneath the masks we wear, to navigate a world that too often values appearance over substance and spectacle over sincerity, and Ilara's gift was not that she was blind to his scars, but that she chose to look beyond them, to the man who existed in completeness rather than despite his wounds, and in turn, the Duke's gift to her was seeing her not as a servant defined by her station, but as a whole person worthy of being known and valued and loved. And this is the profound lesson their story offers to each of us, that true seeing requires patience and proximity, and a willingness to return day after day to the work of understanding another human being in all their complexity. That love worthy of the name is not a lightning strike of instant recognition, but a slow accumulation of small moments and careful attention and chosen presence, even when circumstances make such choice difficult or inconvenient. And perhaps most importantly, that we are all waiting to be truly seen by someone who will not flinch from our scars or turn away from our damage, but will instead trace the marks we carry with gentle fingers and say, "Yes, I see all of you, and you are enough." For it is in being fully known and still accepted that we discover our own worth and find the courage to remove the masks we wear and live authentically in a world that too often demands performance over presence. So tonight, as you prepare for rest, may you consider the people in your life whom you have perhaps seen only in surface ways, and may you grant them the gift of deeper attention. May you have the courage to remove your own masks in the presence of those who have earned the right to witness your wholeness. May you practice patience in your connections, knowing that the most meaningful relationships are often those that develop slowly through accumulated gestures rather than dramatic declarations. And may you trust that somewhere there exists someone who will look at all you are scarred and whole, damaged and beautiful, flawed and worthy, and choose to stay not despite what they discover but because of it. For this is how we heal individually and collectively, through the simple, radical act of truly seeing one another and allowing ourselves to be seen in return. This story comes to you from Cora's Cozy Corner, and if it has touched something within you, I invite you to carry its lesson forward into your own life and relationships, to practice the art of patient seeing that Ilara mastered in a cold boot room during 5 long winters, and to remember that the most transformative love is often found not in grand ballrooms or dramatic gestures, but in quiet spaces where two people dare to show each other their unmasked faces and discover that they are beautiful precisely because they are real. May your rest be peaceful and your dreams be gentle, and may you wake tomorrow with eyes trained to see beneath surfaces and a heart brave enough to be seen in return.